get underway. So thanks a lot for joining us this morning. Firstly, I just want to apologise. We had some IT issues getting this one sorted out. We're trying to minimise the number of emails, and with a couple of vagaries of Microsoft, we ended up sending more emails than we would have if we left it alone. So apologies for that. We'll get better next time. Also want to remind people that we've got the opportunity to follow up on things that come up in these workshops, working with a couple of utilities at the moment on some pandemic planning and business continuity planning, which is really interesting, and also working with a few utilities on their support for hand washing facilities in their communities. So please feel free to get in touch with us at any time about anything that's coming up in the workshops, as well as anything in the TA that we can help you with, so always around. And just a reminder that we've got the Water Safety Plan workshop with Clara Layden on the 12th of March, and I'll send a bit more information about that in the next week or so. So without further ado from me, I'll hand over to Alex. Did you want to kick us off this morning?
Sure. Thanks, Dean, and thanks for going through some of the house rules on muting mics and also where to type messages in and so on. Hi everyone, this is Alex. I'm the from ADB's Pacific Department's Urban and Water team, and together with my colleague Vivian, who's also on the call, we're the team leaders for ADB's WASH Regional Technical Assistance, which is supporting today's workshop on financial sustainability of utilities and the impacts of COVID-19. We also have a much larger team of ADB staff and consultants supporting this TA. Some of them are based in Manila and others across the Pacific. And I wanted to give a particular thanks to Dean, who's been leading the planning of this workshop series in coordination with PWWA, who we'll hear from in a moment. This is the third in the series of workshops. The first back in November was on pandemic planning and business continuity, and the second was on strategies for supplying water to informal areas and hand washing in public places. The topics we'll be covering in this series are all linked to the WASH TA objective, which is to build resilience to COVID-19 in the Pacific through strengthening WASH practices in communities, as well as the enabling environment for improved WASH. And it's in that latter area where utilities are obviously key stakeholders, given their mandate to supply water and in many cases power and sewerage services to the population. So in the virtual room here today, we have a good turnout from our Pacific water utility counterparts. We have the team from PWWA and several ADB staff from different teams. So some are urban and water specialists, some are from the broader WASH TA team. We've also invited our financial management specialists covering the Pacific. And I think that's about all I wanted to cover in my intro. I did want to just see if our DG is here yet to give an introduction on behalf of ADB, but I think if Leah is there, please jump on the mic. If not, I might ask Lucia first if she's ready to give a introduction on behalf of PWWA. Is that all right with you, Lucia, to jump in now?
Yes, that would be fine. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks. Sure.
Okay, well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. And of course, a warm welcome to this series next of our workshops for Pacific Utilities under the auspices of the ADB Regional TA for strengthening WASH practices and hygiene behavioral change in the Pacific. And we are fortunate, of course, to have been able to incorporate today's workshop on financial sustainability of water utilities and the impacts of COVID-19 as part of the series of workshops. Thanks to the head of the Pacific Department of ADB, Ms. Jin Ming, and her staff and consultants for the active support to the Pacific. And I'd also like to make a warm welcome to our guest speakers for this workshop from Wedgewood White Limited, Paul White and Paul Weber, who will go through their experience with the financial impacts of COVID-19 and some of the strategies that have been put into place by utilities to ensure their ongoing financial sustainability during the pandemic. And of course, thank you very much, Alexandra Conroy from ADB's Pacific Department, who will moderate the session. And many thanks to all our member utility CEOs from PWWA and your staff for joining in to participate in this workshop. We hope the discussions and the workshop will be of mutual benefit to all of us. So enjoy, ask questions, and share your experiences. And I'll hand it back to Dean Taylor or Alexandra to introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucia. Thanks very much for hopefully all of you already know who PWWA is, but if not, then that was a great introduction from Lucia. We have a program of about 1.5 hours today, including the main presentation and Q&A, and we'll try to stick to time. I did want to just briefly mention today's session is also supported by another ADB technical assistance, which was mentioned on the first slide. It's a regional TA called Implementing a Differentiated Approach to Urban Development in the Pacific. And in line with Strategy 2030, which is the main corporate strategy of ADB, that TA acknowledges the distinct development challenges in the Pacific and promotes a differentiated approach to operations in these countries. Why I mention it and how it relates to today's session is the acknowledgement that building resilience of our sector to COVID-19 in the Pacific may not look like it would in other regions. So on that note, as Lucia mentioned, we really hope many of you will be willing to share your thoughts and experiences on this topic. You'll have a captive audience, so I certainly encourage your active engagement. And on the mechanics, as Dean mentioned earlier, you can type in the message box. I think raise your hand as well if you'd like to speak, and Dean, as well as my colleague Lass, will be monitoring the message box. So I think that's it from me. What I want to do now is introduce the team who will be presenting. Some of you may have met Paul and Paul before. Wedgewood White is a New Zealand-based consultancy specializing in financial, economic, and commercial analysis of infrastructure businesses and projects. Paul White will be leading today and supported by Paul Weber. Both are qualified in engineering and finance, and they work with engineers, governments, and financial institutions to deliver expert analysis of complex infrastructure projects. Most recently, Paul and Paul have been working with us with utilities in FSM and Solomons. So without further ado, actually, I just want to pause for one moment to see if our Director General, Leah, is ready to give an introduction on behalf of ADB.
Hello. Hi, Alex, I'm ready.
Yes, please go ahead, Leah. I've given a brief introduction, but please go ahead.
Yes, okay, and thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many of you from our water utility counterparts around the Pacific. It's a pleasure for me to introduce today's workshop on financial sustainability of utilities and the impact of COVID-19 as part of a broader series of workshops that ADB is supporting under the Pacific WASH Regional Technical Assistance, which was approved in 2020 in response to the pandemic. The role of water utilities in supporting the enabling environment for improved health and hygiene during a pandemic cannot be overstated. And we have no doubt that those here today, all of you, would have experienced one of the most demanding years on record in trying to maintain service levels and ensure business continuity despite lockdowns and travel restrictions. At the same time, water utilities are trying to balance this with a new set of challenges that affect the bottom line. Things like increased non-revenue water, delays in capital works improvements, and perhaps reduced demand from industrial customers, which previously represented a key revenue source. We are keen to hear from you today during the workshop and through subsequent discussions with us ADB project teams on your experiences, noting that this ADBTA is also intended to provide demand-driven support to utilities as key stakeholders in building resilience to the pandemic. So with that, I thank you again for making the time in your schedules to join us today, and I sincerely hope that you find it a useful opportunity to gain some insights from your peers across the region on how they have responded to these challenges. We certainly look forward to learning from you and to seeing you in future workshops. Thank you. Over to you, Alex.
Okay, thank you, DG Leah from ADB's Pacific Department. So without further ado, I welcome Paul to start the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex, and thanks for the introduction, and hello to everybody. It's nice to see so many of you along today. Today's agenda, firstly, we're going to talk about what we mean by financial sustainability. It's a term that's used a lot, and it has different definitions depending on context. So we're going to start by getting into exactly what we're talking about by financial sustainability. Then we're going to get into the financial impacts of COVID-19. So exactly how utilities have been impacted, and how the balance has been restored between the cash coming in and cash coming out. We're then going to look at we'll continue with the idea of the systematic framework for planning that was introduced in the business continuity planning workshop, the one before last, I think it was. We'll then look at a case study courtesy of our friends in UNELCO, and then we'll get into some questions and answers. Sitting next to me is my colleague Paul Webber. For convenience, we're sitting on one computer with one microphone and one camera. But I'm going to turn the camera off now because you don't want to see me, I'm sure. So, but now you know what I look like. Right. Okay. The first thing we're going to do, though, this has the potential to be a dry workshop, and the use of Zoom makes it even more difficult to engage with you. So we'll try and make it a bit more interesting by starting with a poll. And the poll is as follows. What was the reduction in your revenue for your business in 2020 compared to 2019? So let me start the poll. You should see it pop up now. Yes, and so I'd like you all, and preferably one response per utility, to tell us what the revenue reduction was. Whether it's gross revenue or net revenue, we don't really care. Whether it's 2020 compared to 2019, or whether it's actual 2020 compared to budget 2020, it doesn't really matter. We'd just like to get a sense from you of how this looks. And I see some of you already responding. So we'll give it a sort of a 30 seconds or a minute just to see. Our guess before starting this was probably an average of in the 5 to 15% range, but it's likely that we're proven wrong. So far, what are we at? You seeing the results? Yeah. Less than 5, 71%. Give it another 10 seconds or so. Okay, I think we'll quit it there. So let's say of those who know, everyone had less than 5%. Oh, there's another less than 5. So we're a bit surprised by that, but it is encouraging, let's say. Okay, let me end that poll. Bring it back up. I think it's fine. It's ended. Okay, you can't see it. I'm co-president. Okay, is that just checking the poll has gone from the screen? Dean, can you see the poll, or is it gone?
Sorry, I had it up on my screen too, guys. Maybe
we co-host.
Yeah, maybe Alex, could you just make sure that's gone for us?
Yep, it's gone.
Okay,
Done. Thanks. Right. So I'm going to hand to Paul just to talk about financial sustainability.
Good morning. Good afternoon. Okay. If the first thing to say with respect to financial sustainability is that there is no accepted definition of financial sustainability for water and wastewater utilities. So we propose a definition that is related to the ability of an organisation to fund operations over time. This over time part of the definition is important. It means that the service should be enduring. And sustainability also has this internal concept of servicing community from its own internal resources. So the two aspects that we want to emphasise are enduring over time and from your own resources. We're going to talk about a hierarchy of financial sustainability. I think we can sort of all agree that a business that cannot fund its operating and maintenance expenses is not sustainable. And by fund, we mean recover sufficient to recover revenue. And that's normally through tariffs and other charges, but it also might be through government payment, such as normally called a community service obligation, but maybe it's called a government service obligation or a public service obligation. If revenue is insufficient to cover operating and maintenance expenses, then you need one of two things: either have to reduce operating and maintenance expenses, or you have to have external funding brought into the organisation, and so that doesn't meet the definition of sustainable. Of course, if you have debt, then you need to pay interest as well. And we say that if you can achieve both of those two things, fund your operation and maintenance costs and your interest costs, then we describe that as being operationally sustainable. That means that you can keep running the business from those assets that exist at the moment. But that's not all you need for full sustainability. Sort of a more profound sustainability requires that you can fund replacement of assets when they come to the end of their operational life. Sometimes you hear this described as being able to fund your depreciation. If you have sufficient revenue to replace assets at the end of their life, then you can maintain the service potential of those assets in perpetuity. So that's maintain the current supply footprint. But still, that's not complete sustainability. Full sustainability requires that you can, so if you can recover a little bit more revenue, then you can fund growth over time. And that could be expanding the business out into new areas, or it could be improving the service quality for the existing customer base. Now, I think that the main point of presenting this hierarchy here is that the impact of COVID-19 and any other financial crisis will be different depending on where you sit in this sustainability hierarchy. If you're one of the few businesses that is earning a return on investment, then a financial shock means just poorer financial results in a particular year. But if you're unable to fund your replacement capex, then a financial shock will sort of further constrain what you can do, which means moving away from the least cost way of running your business, the least cost asset management plan, which means higher overall costs, higher bills, or more heavily relying on government or development partners. And if you're if you're only just struggling to already recover your operations and maintenance in a normal year, then obviously a further financial shock is going to mean that some very hard decisions have to be made on what you can afford to spend money on.
Okay, let's now focus on the specifics of the impact of COVID-19 for water and wastewater businesses in the Pacific. How has it impacted you? We've got some broad ideas here, and as Dean and Alex has already said, we're really keen to hear your own experiences, and please feel free to pose questions or to engage with us during the Q&A at the end. And I'll preface this by saying that we expect there are two main categories of utilities, of water utilities in the Pacific, represented here today. One is those for whom tourism is directly or indirectly responsible for a lot of water consumption. And the second category is those for whom tourism and industry is not a major contributor to demand, and possibly haven't experienced the same significant reduction in demand as a consequence of tourism being turned off. Today, we're really concentrating on the first, the financial impacts of lower demand. Obviously, the main financial impact, although possibly not as major as we thought based on the results of that poll, but the main financial impact is lower income. Lower income accounting sense and lower income in a cash sense. The main driver, to use that expression, of lower income, of course, is reduced demand. Typically from industrial and commercial customers, many of whom have been forced to reduce their operations or shut down entirely because there's no demand or because the government's told them to shut down. And obviously those customers are responsible they are a major contributor to demand. But also all customers in many cases have a reduced ability to pay. So households have lost jobs or have had income reduced for various reasons. They still have a demand for water, household water, but they have a reduced ability to pay. So those two things combine result in significantly lower accounting and cash income. The second thing we have there is changes in disconnection policy, and we'll come back to this shortly. It may be that the government or your board or shareholders have made a decision that change disconnection policy so that customers who need water at home have it, no matter whether they can pay for it or not. That may have also resulted in lower income for your businesses. Other impacts. The first one we have there is delayed projects. And projects might have been delayed because governments or boards have taken a decision to temporarily suspend capital works projects, or maybe you've had to suspend those projects because equipment can't be imported or foreign experts are unable to travel, those sorts of things. And of course, delayed projects, longer projects cost more. Cost more because financing charges increase, interest during construction increases, and other financing charges. They cost more because costs escalate as a consequence of delays. Or you may trigger penalty clauses in contracts, or you may be faced with rebidding costs if projects are cancelled entirely. There might also be some hidden costs, future costs of delays today. So projects that aren't done now result in much higher downstream costs. Maybe you call that the long COVID. The second one and other impacts there is increased non-revenue water. And that might have occurred because leaks aren't being fixed. Crews are unable to go into the field to fix leaks quickly as they would normally do. NRW might have increased because of increased hardship. People are unable to pay their bills, but they still need water, so they may be stealing it where otherwise they weren't. We also wonder whether higher proportion of domestic consumption in the sales mix might result in higher NRW because of the inherently longer supply lengths to domestic customers, and also because of the higher number of connections in domestic areas. Or possibly the volumetric leakage hasn't changed, but the sales volume has reduced, and so the percentage NRW has increased. The last one there under other impacts is higher chemical dosing costs. So maybe that you've used a higher set point for chlorine in potable water, or you've been dosing chlorine into untreated water before discharge. We haven't included a bullet point there for unique COVID-19 one-off costs that weren't budgeted for. For example, increase in the requirement for PPE. That's one that immediately springs to mind, but there may have been other ones. So overall, we have to balance the books. Financial sustainability means, as a bare minimum, we have to have enough cash to meet our operating costs. So we either reduce expenses and or increase lost cash income, of course, while maintaining 24/7 operations. And we may be able to inject some other cash into the system by drawing on reserves in whatever form those reserves might take. And we'll talk about reserves a bit later. So just to, we're going to do another poll now, just to make sure that people are still awake and with us. The poll relates to disconnections. Let me just see if I can fire it up. And now do the second poll. Close that one down. Just bear with me. Start sharing. Sorry, technical issues, folks. Okay, here we go. Disconnections, launch poll. Have you changed your disconnection policy in response to COVID-19? Please, so we hope we've covered all possibilities here. If the exact, your exact situation doesn't fit, then just find the closest one. So you don't know if your disconnection policy's changed. No, water is an essential service. You never disconnect customers. No, we are still disconnecting customers who don't pay, or yes, we've softened our policy, and yes, we are in fact reconnecting customers to make sure that everyone has access.
Paul, would you be able to share the results of the polls as you go through?
Yeah.
I think you have to hit a button there.
Yeah. So we're sitting in an average of no, still disconnected customers who don't pay. Okay, I'm going to end that one now. We've had a few responses, and I'll share the results. Okay, so a range of responses there, and we're interested to hear a bit later, possibly the specifics of those policies.
20% have changed their policy.
Yeah, so in summary, only 20% have changed. Okay, I'll stop sharing that now. And you can see the results, and let's close that down, and I'll go on to the next slide, particular issues for Pacific water utilities. Here we've highlighted some particular challenges for Pacific water utilities. None of these should be a particular surprise, although possibly not all of them will apply to all of you. The first point we'll make is that, unlike a lot of the rest of the world, the COVID-19 has been primarily a commercial crisis rather than a health one. We've had relatively low infection rates, very low mortality rates. There haven't been a lot of people forced to stay home because they're unwell. The crisis has arisen because tourists aren't coming, because people are forced to stay home for other reasons, and that has caused significant downturn and significant reduction in demand and therefore income, et cetera, et cetera. Small revenue base, heavily dependent on a few large customers. So we know the revenue base is often not well diversified. Perhaps a few big customers responsible for 10% of sales volume or something like that. And with those customers forced to reduce their operations or possibly shut down entirely, you might have seen a big hole in sales volumes that other parts of the world wouldn't have seen those same holes as a consequence of a few large customers. Related to that is that water tariffs, of course, might be significantly higher for commercial and industrial customers. So there's a cross subsidy. So while you might have only seen a 10% reduction in sales volume as a consequence of those commercial customers reducing operations, you might have seen a 15 or 20% reduction in revenue from those customers. water and wastewater tariffs often low, have no fixed component. So whereas the businesses, as we know, are predominantly fixed, the tariffs around the other way. So this reduction in sales has materially affected you. You're also not necessarily in control of your own destinies. The government sets the tariff and related subsidies. The government might have announced water bill relief to some customers, or they might have forced a suspension of disconnections, although possibly not based on the poll results we're seeing. And the government may just have expected the utilities to absorb the financial impacts of their policies. You might also be heavily or completely dependent on the government for operating and capital budgets. And COVID-19 might have forced governments to redirect those budgets into relief packages or to meet other one-off costs related to the pandemic. Often we see no independent regulator to whom you could perhaps petition for financial sustainability related measures. And you may have less automation, so more dependent on people rather than automation to keep the cash flowing. For example, you have staff and customers stuck at home, so meters aren't read, bills are not delivered, and even if you can read meters and deliver bills, maybe people aren't allowed out of their houses to pay those bills. End result, less revenue.
Okay. We talked earlier about the requirement to balance the books. And so two sides of that equation are reducing expenditure and increasing income. So I'm now going to start talking about the things that we can do to reduce expenditure. And going back to our sort of hierarchy of sustainability, our first block was operating and maintenance costs, and many of these are not controllable, but one of the slightly controllable costs, more controllable costs, is staff costs. And so a typical response we have seen is to reduce expenditure is to lower staff costs. So I learned a new word in 2020, and that was furlough, which means to send staff home on altered pay and conditions, less pay with the ability to bring them back later. It's a sort of a temporary redundancy. Also commonly we have seen reductions in pay. It's thought to be better to reduce pay by, in this example, 20% than to reduce the workforce by 20%. Better in terms of fairer, and also better in that it retains that workforce to enable you to recover from the crisis as it passes. And the third thing we have there on that list is to carefully plan work to avoid unnecessary overtime. And that also relates to our second point there, which is to defer non-essential operating and maintenance expenditure. Non-essential expenditure might be things like asset inspections or painting of pump stations and buildings. It's important that deferral means reducing, expenditure on external contractors and potentially reducing contractor expenditure. You can utilise your own staff that you would have had to keep paying anyway. Second block here is interest, and one option is to negotiate changes in your debt servicing profile. So move to an interest-only repayment schedule, negotiate holiday in principal repayments, or lengthen the term of your loan so that each principal repayment becomes smaller. With respect to end-of-life replacement, common response has been to delay or defer or cancel capital projects, which will retain cash in the short term. And obviously, if you were planning a cash distribution, a dividend or other distribution to your shareholder, you can defer that payment, which will save cash now. Obviously, if you're going to do that, that would be the first thing to do rather than the last in our order here. And businesses have done more than one of these things, picking one or two of these different options to reduce expenditure.
Okay, so that's the expenditure side, and there are some practical things that can be done quite quickly there. Things are not as simple on the revenue side, on the recovering revenue. Options are limited. Unfortunately, you can't just find new customers, and you can't just put up prices. At least you can't do those things overnight. So these things we're talking about need to be put in place before the emergency or disaster strikes. We suggest that the first thing is to put in place mechanisms that reduce your exposure to revenue shock. And there are some regulatory arrangements that allow for risk sharing. And so we're going to just talking about some of those. So an example is revenue cap regulation. Under a revenue cap, the utility is allowed to earn a certain amount of revenue in each year. And that revenue is calculated to ensure that the utility can cover its costs. Under a revenue cap regulation, if the volume is lower in a particular year, as has happened for most of 2020, the revenue reduction is not lost forever. It's still there. It can be recovered from customers in future years. So changing the regulatory mechanisms is not something that can be done quickly. So this is not something that's going to help to recover revenue in the short term. So the other thing we want to talk about here is tariff structures. Paul, can you please just take over for a sec?
Yeah, so we can use, so if tariffs were perfectly cost reflective, then a reduction or increase in sales would not affect profit. But this is never the case. And in Pacific Water and wastewater, it is almost universally very, very low fixed charge. So typically 5% of revenue is fixed when more 70% or much more of costs are fixed. And tariffs are structured as an increasing rate block, with commercial tariffs much higher than residential. This is a practice that's evolved over time, and for a good reason. It's pro-poor, and it generally reflects the ability to pay within the community. However, these tariff structures do leave utilities extremely vulnerable to reductions in sales, and particularly commercial sales. So what to do? The simple answer is to increase fixed charges. But we acknowledge that that's not always possible. So then you need to have a discussion with regulator or government about what's best for your community. And if you can't put in place a tariff structure that is more robust, then you need to put in one of these other mechanisms, such as a revenue cap, to make your income less sensitive to small changes in sales volumes.
So revenue cap regulation, change in tariff structure are both things that can't be done overnight. Shorter term responses, access to disaster recovery funds. Hopefully, well, there might be a facility in place. Hopefully there is a facility in place. And that can be capped from the government or from development partners or others. You might have an internal fund, a rainy day reserve that's been slowly populated over a few years for exactly this purpose, if you're lucky. Something else that might be worth considering is a utility emergency or disaster reserve. The thinking here is that the impact of disasters might not be well correlated between, say, electricity and water supply. For example, cyclones can be catastrophic for electricity supply infrastructure. All the above ground infrastructure tends to disappear, whereas water supply might not be so badly affected. On the other hand, floods have the reverse impact. So water supply badly affected, but electricity supply largely left intact if you're lucky. So think about a disaster levy for all infrastructure users. Again, not useful overnight. And of course, creating these sorts of reserve funds would need some sort of regulatory or government or shareholder approval. So again, these are ideas for the next event rather than short-term solutions for the current event. Investigate access to government stimulus funds. Infrastructure is almost always a target of stimulus spending. And a couple of reasons listed here: long-lived assets, the benefit stays in the region, those sorts of things. But you need to you need to have these candidate projects prepared and put your hand up. Projects that are shovel ready, meaning they are capital works projects that have been properly planned, they've been detailed, we have a detailed design hopefully available, you have up-to-date cost estimates, there's an economic business case that can be put up to the government. So you need to plan for these projects and have them ready to present to the government, to development partners when the word stimulus starts being used. Get creative. We've added this one here just to ensure that the possibility of doing something entirely different is considered. A case we came across, a water utility in India who earned some additional revenue by undertaking a state government contract to clean and sanitize public areas as part of the state government's COVID response. The utility had underemployed staff, it had water tankers lying around, so it was a perfect opportunity for the water utility to put those people and resources to use and to generate some additional revenue. It also had the additional benefit of keeping staff occupied rather than at home and depressed potentially.
Okay, so we'd like now to talk about systematic approach for thinking about financial sustainability in the context of a COVID-19 or a similar financial shock. I think the first thing to say is that the approach that was outlined in the business continuity planning workshop seems to be very good, and we think works very well both for that operational response, but also for considering a financial dimension. So if you recall that business continuity plan had 4 components: prevent, prepare, respond, and recover. And we'll go through the financial aspects of those in the next few slides. So we support adding a dimension to your plan, to your business continuity plan, that considers the financial implications. And by financial, we mean cash in, cash out, plus interaction with the regulator, your owner, government, and debt providers. Everybody's plan is going to be different. So you can't really prescribe exactly what that's going to look like, but you could add a separate section to the plan for financial aspects, or you could add a column to the template that was provided for financial aspects. I guess the important thing here is that there should be an owner of the financial aspects, because it will be slightly different to the operational part of the plan. We also, whilst this operational approach to business continuity planning has lots of things in common with the financial approach. There is one aspect which is different. Responding to a natural disaster, cyclone or a flood, requires relatively short-term response, whereas this COVID-19 disaster, and we could think of other financial disasters such as the global financial crisis, might have a much longer time frame. So moving on to the components of the plan, the prevent component. Obviously, we can't prevent the current pandemic that's occurred. And it's difficult to think about a way that a single utility or even a group of utilities working together could prevent future pandemics or similar emergencies. But it is possible to reduce the financial damage to your organisation from future disasters. And this is really prepare rather than prevent, and we cover it under prepare. But we do want to keep the prevent part of the plan, because it may be possible to prevent other types of financial crises. And it does help you think about other aspects of your business, say the amount of debt that you hold and how that's denominated. Can we cope with exchange rate variations? Can we cope with interest rate variations? So whilst it doesn't apply to COVID-19, we think you should retain a prevent component to your plan. The next aspect is prepare. So at the top of our list of things to prepare, we say put in place ability to get cash into your business quickly. So that can either be a cash buffer or lines of credit or access to a disaster response fund if you can arrange that in your jurisdiction. The second aspect to preparing is to put in place the regulatory and pricing arrangements that we talked about. So that includes investigating a revenue cap and reviewing tariffs to make sure they can be as robust as possible with respect to changes in volume. So specifically thinking about fixed charges. We also, exactly analogous to the way that an operational business continuity plan operates, we think that identifying critical people and processes is important, and to develop contingencies for keeping those things going. These are those processes that you need to keep cash coming into the business. So how do we keep billing going? How do we keep connections going? So for example, in the case where you can't send people out into the field or have people come to your office to pay for their bills, perhaps a telephone-based system for payments has some merit. Finally, in exactly the same way as the operations business continuity planning works, we think it's important to conduct exercises. So this is probably not going to be done in conjunction with the operational exercises, but as a separate workshop with financial people around the table to look at your operating environment and do a sort of financial stress test.
But it does relate to the operational exercises, in that assumptions might be made about cash availability in the operational planning, and actual cash available could be a very important input into the operational planning exercise. So while they should be conducted separately, there is a strong crossover between the two.
Okay, so now we come to respond. So we didn't prevent this crisis, and we possibly weren't prepared for it. So now we're back to responding. And back to that same concept we've been talking all the way through, which is balancing the books, which means expenditure and income. So the first thing we say is review expenditure. So perhaps set up a little crisis response team to immediately review the cash going out of the business based on the circumstances that are there at the time. We've also talked in this bullet point about periodically after that immediate review, carrying on with that, repeating that exercise to make sure the settings stay appropriate. The second point we have there is to discuss with lenders to get immediate relief from any debt payments that are required in the short term. And the other side of balancing the expenditure and income is your income. And in the short term, we've talked about there are only really two places you can get short-term access to funds from a government emergency funding or stimulus program, or from as a short-term credit line from a bank. Okay, so now the recovery part of the plan. With the operational business continuity plans, and in the media, we've heard quite a lot about rebuilding stronger. We're taking the opportunity to do things better. So what does that mean from a financial perspective? Well, we're primarily thinking about those robust tariff and regulation settings. So that was regulatory framework and tariff fixed charges. Then after that, consider refinancing, so changing the structure of your finances, perhaps changing the debt profile. Now, if it's something other than COVID-19, so a physical disaster rather than just a financial one, so rebuilding from a cyclone, then there'll also be the requirement to review CapEx and OpEx plans to make sure that you can fund the required rebuilding. Now, overall, I guess, and the recovery phase, let's just think about the fact there's a balancing act here. To build back, you need to have a whole lot of capability in place within your organisation to undertake that rebuild. So it's nice to have the staff available to do that, to have retained them through the disaster, and it would be nice to have that excavation contractor still solvent that you can call upon to help with your rebuild. But you need to survive in the short term, so you might have stopped using that contractor. It's very hard to know when you're in the middle of the crisis how you maintain that balancing act of keeping the capability alive and bolting down so that you've retained as much cash as possible. So therefore, we think that frequent reviews and maximum flexibility through your response and recover phase are important.
So that's our views as to what might have happened, but now we're going to hear what really happened. Dean, can I please ask you to introduce our case study?
Great, thanks, Paul. So thanks. It was really interesting to see, to hear what the guys got to say about and how you prepare and plan to respond and recover. So it really does fit into the overall business continuity and planning framework we've been talking about. We had some great discussions with Frederick Petty from UNELCO in Vanuatu. So Fred It's the Director of Development there, and it was really interesting perspective how a utility with private ownership responsible to shareholders responds to COVID. So we've asked Fred if he'd help us today in the presentation, and he's graciously given some time and put some slides together, and we'll talk about the situation in Vanuatu and how they've responded. So over to you, Fred. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, please apologize for my spelling mistakes. I spotted a few, so sorry for that. Okay, yeah, the first slide, that's it. So COVID-19 and Vanuatu. Well, first of all, as many of us, we haven't been affected by COVID. We had a few cases where border cases, but we haven't been confined and so on. So people are free to move around and so on. We were firstly affected early March with cruise ships being forbidden to land, and then borders were closed on the 26th of March. State of emergency was declared on that date, and it has been, well, a few times extended now until July 31st, but we'll see what will happen. Residents are allowed to come back, but foreigners, it's really difficult. And for everyone, quarantine is compulsory. Okay, next. Okay, Vanuatu, 40% of the GDP is directly or indirectly linked to tourism. So you might imagine what happened. All the resorts are closed. Some are reopening, well, from time to time for allowing quarantine, but that's really not business as usual. Many restaurants were shut down. Some industries have been impacted. We don't have much of industry, but brewery and the abattoir, for example, were at their businesses impacted. Retail stores are struggling. Prices are increasing because, well, like many of us, I think the shipping cost is increasing. A lot of expats left the country, and on the other side, also seasonal workers that are going to Australia and New Zealand were stranded here and were not able to go and work in Australia or New Zealand. They are part of, well, quite a lot of income for low income people here in families in Vanuatu. Okay, so next one. So the direct impact of COVID-19 for UNELCO, well, as you know, UNELCO is a power and water utility, and we were affected for both our businesses. Look at the figures for the HV, so it's the big consumers for energy, it's -16, 2020 against 2019. But if you look at the third column, it's the for the time of the COVID, well, the time we were affected by COVID, and it's -21. LV customers, which are 99% of the customers, it's -5 and -6. And for the water customers, overall, it's down 5%, but if you look at March to December, it's -7. So definitely we've been affected in both activities. If we go to the next one, please. The fact is that the situation is even worsening. On the left side, you've got quarters by quarters, the daily consumption. The red line is 2020. So you could spot that Q1 and Q2, we were mostly the same than the 4 previous years. But since then, we are down, and it's going even lower. Q4, if you look at the graph on the right, the daily consumption, we are we have reached back the level of 2015, and we are even lower than when we had Cyclone Pam in 2015. So it's a crisis as deep, for the time being, as deep as a cyclone. Definitely you see that the drop for cyclone was not that one, but I hope it will it won't last much. So that's it for the picture. The next one, please. Well, Paul, you were talking about having tariffs adapted and so on. In Vanuatu, well, at UNELCO, we've got step tariffs. Depending on whether you are consuming more than 50, between 50 and 100 cubic meter per quarter, and then the last one being over 200. The curve on the graph on the left shows for those different steps. So the blue one is the lower step, so from 0 to 50 cubic, orange being 50 to 100. 150, I think, to 100, no, to 50 to 100, then the gray 100 to 200, and then the yellow over 200. So you see that, well, as long as you go beyond 50 cubic, it's going down, and definitely for the big consumers, the yellow one, we are down by nearly a third. The graph on the right, it's the same view, but in Vanuatu. So to compare those periods, I was able to compute a Vanuatu per day against a cubic meter per day. What you see is that for the last two quarters, step 4, we are down 20–25%. Paul, you were mentioning, well, having some fixed tariff. We've got a fixed fee within our tariff structure. It's the light blue on the right graph, and it's quite stable. All the other consumptions are now down. And globally, we were down -1% in 2020 versus 2019, but it's more related to a price effect, I'd say, than a volume. Volume, we would be down if the tariff has not been changed. The tariff is set by the contract, and it's based on a few components. So in a way, well, business side, luckily the tariff has increased at the right time, but it's not really good for consumers, obviously. Next one, please. So, well, managing the crisis. Well, the UNELCO management has took decisions really early, and we had that what you called business continuity plan as early as January 2020, when we've seen that in Europe it was becoming a catastrophe. In a few countries there were problems and so on. So there have been some decisions at that time. Definitely, we kept the same level of services as we are deemed to by the contract. So we haven't changed anything for the customers. We have tried to keep the highest level of recovery possible. Definitely, we've cut the people that were not paying bills. The number of water cuts have doubled 2020 against 2019. And the bad debt has increased by 30%. So definitely there is an impact, but we are trying to keep afloat on that one. On the other side, as Paul, you were mentioning, yeah, there are expenses. So we have reduced the volume of investments. Some were delayed, some were, well, the sizing was decreased. So that has an impact. Instead of going for subcontracting some operations, we have moved them back to in-house capacities. It's really hard on that case because you have to keep some subcontractors afloat, because when you will have to start again, the new normal, let's say, we will need them. So you have to keep them afloat, but okay, we've found some ways to go on. Definitely, we put a lot on leak detection and leak repairs, because that's pure cash, and that's a way where you can really find money back. There hasn't been anything related to staff expenses. We haven't cut down the hours, we haven't cut down the salaries, and so on. This was a possibility within the business continuity plan, but it has not been set up at the moment. And we've got talks with the government. There have been some stimulus packages for businesses. We were not targeted then, but now it's more like, and it stopped. Now we are more like to find ways to maybe having some lower tariffs and ways to compensate the revenue losses for UNELCO. So that's the place we are at the moment. Luckily, well, first of all, customers kept on paying their bills. There have been a lot of them just realizing that most of their bills were leakages. For example, all those resorts, they kept some water consumptions. They were never down to zero. They may be half their consumption. It means that their consumption is composed by maybe half by leaks, which is an issue. And in the new normal, maybe, well, they will just realize that and fix that. I don't know if that will happen in your operation or utilities, but that's something that might have an impact for the new normal. So basically, that's it. We've got VAT here, 15%, and that was one of the ways to reduce the bills with the government. But for instance, it's not something which is taken into account in the short term. So basically, that's what is happening here. I'm just going back to my notes. Something that really affected us on the income, that's the cruise ship and the visiting ships coming to Vanuatu, whether it's cargoes or cruise ships. The volume we are selling are down 70%. We used to supply them with water, and they were really happy of the service we were providing, but now they've disappeared. So that's also part of the loss of the revenues. So that's basically what is the current situation for us now. I'd like to know whether, well, you've got similar situation in yours. Thank you.
That was excellent. Thanks a lot for that, Fred. Just a question for you. Are you finding pressure from the government to reduce the number of disconnections of customers? Are they worried about you disconnecting in the times of COVID?
No. At the moment, there haven't been any reaction from the government. I was looking, but disconnections were, disconnection we had last year, well, no, 2019, we had 600 something disconnection, and we have 843 disconnection this year. This is for total customer number of 8,800. So there is an increase, but it's not that it's not big. I mean,
yeah. Excellent. Before we move on, does anyone have any questions for Fred while he's got the microphone? We can think of your questions. We'll come back. We'll have some more questions at the end. So excellent. Thanks again, Fred, for taking the time to share that with us and pull those slides together. I was swapping emails with Ian Gooden in the Solomons. So I just wonder, Ian, are you there? Ian had some perspectives from the Solomons as well. So some similarities and maybe some differences if we've got Solomons on the line. No, maybe Ian couldn't join us. Solomon's there? Anyone there? No, maybe not. We'll come back if Ian can, or someone from the Solomons can join us.
I
think the microphone's muted there.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, got you now. Yep.
Okay, sorry, we're having a small problem with batteries in the mouse.
Okay, thanks, Ian.
And we've got a pretty weak signal too, so we'll see how we go. If you can just see me over here with some of my colleagues. Thank you for that. I just very quickly, so our situation is probably a little bit different to Vanuatu, and I was just trying to look at the percentage of tourism that we have, and two different sources. One tell me about 3.9 or 4% of GDP. And the other one, which says tourism and travel, is about 12%. And I suspect that includes a lot of work-related travel, for example, for donor agencies and people living here, going in and out and things like that. But anyway, we have a far lower reliance on tourism. Our big commodities, or our big sort of earners in GDP for the country are mining and logs and fishing. So we had I suppose in some ways, and listening to Fred, I would think the impact for us in some ways feels much lower. We've had no community spread of COVID, as have Vanuatu. One thing that happened back in March is our government pretty much told everybody that if they were not gainfully employed in Honiara, they should go home to the provinces. And there was a couple of weeks of almost panic when tens of thousands of people jumped on ships and went back to their provinces. And you may have seen in the news at that time, we had I think about 29 people washed overboard from a ferry in bad weather with a grossly overloaded ferry. So that's been attributed to our COVID deaths, was those poor people that were killed in a ferry accident. What happened is a lot of people, I think, went back to their villages and very quickly found that they probably weren't particularly welcome, and there was not a lot of food or money around in the village. And so I think within weeks, like literally 2 or 3 weeks, some of them started drifting back to Honiara again. Some of our key hotels are still quite empty. And so we did notice quite a drastic drop in our water consumption and our revenue in sort of March and April and into May. We, like UNELCO, acted fairly quickly. Our CFO was very much conscious of the revenue and the cash impact. And we reduced working hours for staff. We laid off some casuals, and I took a small salary cut as well. And we also grossly or very severely cut our spend. All travel, training, of course, we couldn't do any in-country or out-of-country training. And we cut our expenses very, very heavily. So we really cut expense, and we managed to match our revenue. We did receive a $5 million domestic stimulus from our government, which was donor funded. and about $1 million of that went directly to revenue. The others went into capital works and employment generation and things like that. From about September, we started to recover financially. Revenue sort of bounced back to similar levels to what we would have expected. And we've actually finished the year fairly well financially. But there are things like stimulus and some reimbursements from the donors that impacted. I suppose for us, the biggest issue at the moment is work has slowed as consultants have been unable to get in and manage work effectively. We've got a massive amount of design work being prepared for construction, and that is probably running nearly a year late now. The consultant was slow, was behind already, but we're finding that that's running very, very slow. We did reduce our domestic disconnections for a while. We sort of put that activity on hold. Obviously, we didn't tell anybody we were doing that, but we just, from a practice perspective, we put that in place. I think that's probably all I really have to offer in terms of what we did and how we managed. We, this year, are looking to try and get that construction work going. We have negotiated a tariff increase with our government, and certainly they were very conscious of affordability. They insisted we reduce the percentage increase and promised to give us some increased, over here we call it a CSO, a community service obligation. So we've reduced the tariff increase, but we have not yet had them promise to honour the increased CSO that we hope we might get for 2021. I think that's probably all I can offer at this stage, Dean, but happy to take any questions if need be.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that with us, Ian. That's really good of you. It's good to see the similarities and the differences between the two countries as well. So we thought that'd be good to get the different perspectives there. And the thing that's come out to me as well is hearing both talk about the planning and the early intervention. So that's a theme you'll hear come through the workshop series. So we've started off with the business continuity pandemic planning, and we're trying to fit all these pieces together now. So we mightn't have been able to see things like COVID, but a lot of the shocks that we see in water utilities are foreseeable. So we can actually work through in a disciplined way, come up with plans and try and prevent a lot of the impacts, I think. So yeah, thanks a lot for from UNELCO and Solomon Water for sharing their thoughts today. So I'll hand back to the Pauls.
Thanks very much, Dean. So we'll throw the floor open to questions or comments. Anyone wants to contribute and tell us about their unique impacts or ask us anything, please feel free to do so.
There's a question there on chat, Paul, about going back to the concept of lowering operation and maintenance costs. Is it possible to identify and target inefficiencies by a review of historical trends of KPIs, comparison to peers, and benchmarking? You got any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, Dean, I think that's a statement rather than a question, and I think it's correct. It's a really good thing to do is to target inefficiencies.
Yeah, and I think there's probably an opportunity through the PWWA as well to do that benchmarking, learn from peers in the Pacific. There's a lot of knowledge out there. So I think, yeah, it might have been a bit of a leading question there. So, but thanks for raising that one. And I did have, there's another one that's popped up as well. Let me bring that one up. So if you had your time again, guys, is there anything that you would suggest? So what are the few things that you'd suggest people would do today to respond to a new disaster like COVID?
Well, glad you asked that question, Dean. It's a good question. I guess it's all about balancing, keeping the business alive now and making sure it can recover and protecting customers. So the three things that we'd probably do now would be, first would be to set up a review body to keep reviewing and balancing and keeping the capability alive. So balancing those three things that I mentioned. The second thing would be to stop any capital cash flows. So just suspend all capital projects, and then probably do a line-by-line review of all expenditure. Whether you suspend all non-essential expenditure and then do that review, or do the review and then push the button, all this has to be done quite quickly. And with the right team in place to do this, you should be able to do that within a day, really. Bear in mind that you have to make sure the operational perspective or operational voice is heard in the financial review, because it's all very well for us bean counter like people to say stop that payment and stop that, and that's not essential. But we need to make sure that the engineers and operators' voices are heard in that. And the third thing we do today is immediately talk to lenders for relief from debt service obligations, and talk to the government or owner for disaster relief.
Yeah, so just to be clear, that first one, when Paul said set up a review body, means a team within the organisation immediately to sort of look at the cash flow implications of the crisis. So probably with the CFO or equivalent, and a group of people around them to look at expenditure and to keep reviewing that to make sure that the business stays healthy whilst also protecting customers and and all the other parties you need to look at, like your contractors. It'd be interesting to hear from the people that actually went through it, whether they have any suggestions for things that they would do earlier or better.
Yeah, hindsight's a wonderful thing, and there might be some useful experience.
So a related question for you both. One of the themes of our TA is to help build resilience and make utilities stronger for the long term. So are there any things that you do now to prepare for the next disaster that might come along? What steps should we take?
Okay, I think you can go back to the prepare part of our slides. I think the things which have the long lead time to set up that you should think about doing first are setting up a disaster recovery fund. So talk to the regulator, talk to government, talk to the other utilities in your jurisdiction, and see if you can organise it to have a disaster recovery fund populated, perhaps from a levy on all utility expenses, electricity, gas, telecommunications, and water. Second thing is to review your regulatory framework and pricing approach. So we talked about that quite a lot. Third thing is to have lines of credit established before you need them. So have that in preparation for the next crisis. And I guess the fourth thing is to be ready to be able to take stimulus projects. And that means having those what we call shovel-ready projects in place. And the really important thing there is that you have a business plan for it, and in particular an economic case, so you can argue why the government should fund your capital project rather than doing something else to stimulate the economy.
Excellent. Thanks, guys. There's another question popped up there. It's probably one for the crowd to get a bit of feedback from all the utilities out there. So if you open up your chat, there's a question from Jingmin about government subsidies for utilities. So has anyone been experiencing a drop in their government subsidy due to overall government funding constraints? So if you want to pop a response into the chat, that'd be good. It's interesting for us just to see what's happening from a utility perspective. So feel free to use the chat. So we're getting close to the end of our time for everyone here. So we've probably got time for one more question before we hand over. Going. Okay. So thanks a lot for the two Pauls for the presentation, and thanks again to Fred and Ian for their contribution. So I might just hand over to Alex. Are you going to take it from here to close us out?
Yep. Just to echo your comments, Dean. Thanks a lot to Paul and to everybody who's participated today. Just to mention that if today's session, like for the other sessions, has raised any questions or it sort of triggered some ideas about potential areas of support from ADB, then for the utilities, please get in touch. You can either put a message in the message box. Otherwise, if you would all know who your focals are from ADB for each country, so please get in touch with them. I think Dean and Paul might just stay on the line after we officially end if you wanted to have an informal chat with any of them and stick around. Otherwise, I encourage everyone to look out for the invite for the next session, which will be on water safety planning on, I think it's 12th March. So otherwise, thanks everybody and see you soon.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks for everyone for coming along. We'll see you on the 12th of March. Thanks again, Fred. We'll catch up with you soon.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Dean.
Yeah.
See you on the 12th.
Yeah, great. Yeah, that really added a lot of value and a lot of context for the discussion, so it's really helpful.
Okay. See you then. Bye.
Fred, thanks very much. We haven't met you, but thank you very much. Sorry, I just wanted to say also thanks to Fred, because that was a really great contribution. It really fitted in well with what we were trying to say. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Paul.
You can probably turn the recording off now, Dean, if you.
Yep, I'll do that.